Mariam was just 13 when she left her small village to live with her uncle in the city, hoping for a better life. But what she didn't know was that her new home would become a place of fear and pain. This story is a powerful reminder that no matter how much we trust family, our children's safety must always come first. Mariam's journey will touch your heart and make you ask, are we truly listening to our children? After this story, you will never send your children to live with any of your relatives. Before we dive into this story, please consider subscribing to my channel, turning on notifications, and letting me know where you are watching from in the comments. Mariam was a happy 13-year-old girl who lived in a small village. She loved playing with her friends and helping her mother cook. But her parents were very poor and wanted a better life for her. One day, they decided to send her to live with her uncle in the city. They believed she would go to a good school and have a bright future. When her uncle came to take her, Mariam was sad to leave her family, but excited to see the city. The city was so big, full of cars and tall buildings. It was nothing like her small village. Her uncle smiled and said, "Welcome, Mariam. This is your new home." When Mariam first arrived in the city, everything felt so new and exciting, but the city was also overwhelming and lonely. The streets were crowded, and people rushed by with no time to notice her. She missed the quiet of her village, the warmth of her parents' embrace, and the safety she had always known. Her uncle's home was nothing like she imagined. It was cold and dark, with little comfort. The city was far bigger than she had ever imagined, and she was left to navigate it alone. Her uncle was always busy, and when he was home, he barely spoke to her. She had no friends and no one to talk to. Every day was a struggle. Mariam would wake up early, doing the chores her uncle assigned without question. She scrubbed floors, washed dishes, and cooked meals, all while longing for a sense of belonging. She would look out of the window, hoping to see someone who would smile at her or wave, but the city felt so distant, so uncaring. As the days passed, Mariam's sadness deepened. She felt invisible, as though no one saw her. Her uncle didn't care if she was happy or sad, he only wanted her to work harder. She tried to stay strong, but the loneliness weighed heavily on her young shoulders. The city, which was supposed to offer her a better life, only seemed to trap her further. No one knew the silent struggle she was facing. No one knew that beneath her quiet exterior, Mariam was desperately holding on to the hope that somehow, someone would notice her pain. At first, everything seemed fine. Mariam helped with cleaning and cooking. She missed her family, but she tried to stay strong. Her uncle promised to send her to school soon, so she worked hard to make him happy. But little by little, things began to change. Her uncle would shout at her for small mistakes, like dropping a plate, or not sweeping the floor properly. He said, "You're useless, just like your parents." His words hurt Mariam, but she stayed quiet. She felt lonely in the big city. Her uncle wouldn't let her play outside, or talk to anyone. "Stay inside. The city is dangerous," he said. Mariam didn't know why, but she started feeling scared in her new home. At night, she cried softly, hugging the small blanket her mother gave her. She wished she could go back home, but she didn't know how to tell her parents she was unhappy. Mariam's uncle started acting strange. He was kind when people visited, but when they left, he became angry. One day, Mariam spilled some water while cleaning. Her uncle grabbed her arm hard and shouted, "Are you stupid?" Mariam's arm hurt, but she didn't cry. Things got worse. Her uncle would yell at her almost every day. He gave her more chores and didn't let her rest. When Mariam asked about school, he said, "You don't need school. You're here to help me." Mariam missed her family even more. She wanted to tell her mother, but her uncle warned her, "If you complain, I'll punish you." She didn't want to make him angrier, so she kept quiet. One night, her uncle came home drunk. He stumbled into the house and shouted her name. Mariam froze. He pulled her close and said, "You think you're too good to listen to me?" His breath smelled bad, and his grip was tight. Mariam felt scared like never before. After that night, her uncle began treating her even worse. He would look at her in a way that made her feel sick. Sometimes, he forced her to stay up late, doing work while he watched. Mariam tried to stay strong, but she felt trapped. She wasn't allowed to talk to neighbors or go outside without his permission. When she asked to call her parents, he said, "No. They don't need to hear from you." Mariam started to feel like she had no one to help her. She wanted to run away, but where would she go? Every night, she prayed for someone to save her, but no one came. One night, Mariam was asleep when her uncle barged into her room. He was angry and smelled of alcohol. "You don't do anything right," he shouted. Mariam tried to say sorry, but he grabbed her arm and pushed her to the floor. "You'll learn to listen to me," he said with a cold voice. He did something Mariam didn't understand, but knew was very wrong. She cried and begged him to stop, but he didn't. When it was over, he whispered, "If you tell anyone, I'll hurt you and your family." Mariam couldn't sleep that night. She curled up on the floor, shaking and crying quietly. Her body hurt, but her heart hurt even more. She felt ashamed and alone. The next day, her uncle acted like nothing had happened. He gave her chores and told her to smile when the neighbors came over. "If you don't act happy, they'll ask questions," he warned. Every night became a nightmare for Mariam. Sometimes, her uncle tied her up so she couldn't fight back. She didn't understand why this was happening to her. She wanted to call her parents, but her uncle never let her near the phone. Mariam tried to stay brave. She thought about her mother and father and how much she missed them. But she was afraid to tell them the truth. What if they didn't believe her? What if her uncle hurt them too? Mariam began to lose hope. She felt like no one cared about her. At night, she prayed harder than ever. "God, please help me," she whispered through her tears. But the days kept getting darker, and she felt trapped in her uncle's house. Mariam started to change. She no longer smiled, and her eyes were always filled with fear. She tried to hide her bruises by wearing long sleeves, but sometimes they were too big to cover. One day, while sweeping outside, a neighbor asked, "Mariam, are you okay? You look sad." Mariam wanted to tell her everything, but her uncle was nearby, watching. She forced a smile and said, "I'm fine, Auntie." Inside, Mariam felt like screaming. She wanted someone to notice her pain, but she was too scared to ask for help. Her uncle always warned her, "No one will believe you. They'll say you're lying." His words made her feel even more trapped. One evening, her uncle sent her to buy something from a shop far away. It was dark and cold, and Mariam was terrified of walking alone. But she knew refusing would mean a beating. As she walked, she passed a small group of children playing. She stopped for a moment and wished she could be free like them. At the shopkeeper noticed her bruises. "Child, what happened to you?" he asked gently. Mariam shook her head and said, "Nothing." But her voice was shaky, and her eyes filled with tears. The shopkeeper knelt down and said, "You can tell me. I won't let anyone hurt you." Mariam wanted to trust him, but she was afraid her uncle would find out. She quickly paid for the items and ran back home. That night, Mariam lay awake, thinking about the shopkeeper's kind words. Could she tell him? Would he help her? She felt torn between fear and hope, unsure of what to do. She prayed again, asking for a way out of her nightmare. The next time her uncle sent her to the shop, Mariam hesitated. She felt nervous, but remembered the shopkeeper's kind face. With shaky hands, she walked into the shop and stood quietly. The shopkeeper noticed her hesitation. "Are you okay, my child?" he asked softly. Mariam looked down, her tears falling onto the counter. "My uncle, he hurts me," she whispered. The shopkeeper's face turned serious. "Tell me everything," he said gently. Mariam, feeling a little braver, explained her uncle's beatings and how he forced her to stay quiet. She didn't talk about everything he did, but the shopkeeper understood enough. "You're not going back there," he said firmly. He quickly called a social worker he knew. When Mariam heard him speak to someone on the phone, her heart raced. "Will he find out?" she asked, trembling. The shopkeeper reassured her, "You're safe now. No one will hurt you again." Within an hour, the social worker arrived with 2 police officers. They gently asked Mariam questions, and for the first time, she felt like someone was listening. The police went to her uncle's house that night. Mariam stayed with the social worker, feeling scared, but also relieved. When they told her that her uncle had been arrested, she burst into tears, not from fear, but from relief. The social worker called Mariam's parents and explained everything. When her mother arrived the next day, she hugged Mariam tightly, crying and apologizing. "I didn't know, my child. I'm so sorry," her mother said over and over. For the first time in months, Mariam felt safe. She knew the road ahead would be hard, but she promised herself she would heal. She wanted to share her story one day to help others like her. Please subscribe to my channel for part 2.